Good evening, and welcome to another of my readings. Tonight, hail Hydra-Slayer. On the mythic combat of Herakles and Athena, Indra and Vak Saraswati, against the demon dragon of the water. Herakles against the Hydra, Indra against Vritra. These are surely some of the best known mythic combats in each of the Greek or classical and Vedic or Hindu legendariums. The similarities immediately begin to suggest themselves. Clearly, each is a fight of the striker/thunderer deific against a demon dragon that is to be found amidst waters. However, there is another, less frequently remarked upon coterminity, one that is rendered all the more striking precisely because of its unexpectedness, and which helps to more strongly demonstrate the fundamental kinship of the Indo-European faith. I am speaking, of course, about the help which both Herakles and Indra had in their respective dragon-slaying ventures. And no, I do not mean Aeolus. You see, in both cases, the essential ingredient of the striker/thunderer's victory is the aid and availment provided by a certain goddess. Hailed amidst the Greeks as Athena, known to the Vedic religion as Saraswati. Without her intervention, the combats in question may have turned out rather differently. And while it is true to state that Athena's direct and vital involvement in the myth is not universally attested amidst the Greek canon, nor for that matter Vak Saraswati's involvement found overtly stated in all the Rigvedic accounts of Indra against Vritra, the fact that these two cultures accord about the presence of the goddess in the myth, and that Athena is very much there in the oldest Greek version of the tale available to us, that contained in Hesiod's Theology, would appear to suggest it unlikely that it was a spontaneous case of convergent evolution by two cultures thousands of miles and 1,000 years apart. Rather, I would infer from this that it is a shared tradition, one which has its ultimate origins back in the Proto-Indo-European mythology of the Urhimat, potentially as one variety of the myth of the thunderer and striker versus the demon dragon, amidst others that may have been in circulation even then, or at least at the point wherein the Greeks diverged from Indo-Iranian, if you want to go down that alternate hypothetical line of ethnogenesis. This would accord rather well with the concordance of certain other elements of the Greek scripture concerning Athena, which find almost one-for-one parallel with Rigvedic/Brahmana scriptural materials, as I have already demonstrated in Mahashivratri and the Mytholinguistics of War, Part 3, the mind, the mania, the manu. So, let us briefly compare what the two canons have to say upon the matter. Hesiod, writing in or about the 700s BC, put it thus, open quotes, "Thirdly, Echidna bore the grim Hydra of Lerna, which Hera the goddess with white arms fostered to gratify her implacable hostility to the might of Herakles. But Herakles, the son of Zeus, and the son of Amphitryon, killed this monster with his pitiless sword, aided by warlike Aeolus, and instructed by Athena, the goddess of plunder." In quotes. Now the Brown translation is where that's from. Others choose to phrase it as the Hydra dying at Herakles' hand, open quotes, by the design of, close quotes, or through the plans of, again a quote, of Athena, which renders us with the intriguing potentiality that rather than simply instructing Herakles, Athena may have placed Herakles up against the Hydra as a deliberate stratagem to ensure the beast's downfall. As I say, this is pretty much the oldest directly available Greek source upon the matter, and is also corroborated by artistic depictions found to date from a similar period, as well as later. Other Greek and later Roman sources across the next 1,000 years or so are surprisingly sparse with the actual details of the encounter, and go backward and forward about particular elements in a manner which makes it hard to pin down definitive facts. For instance, whether the Hydra is taken out of action by having its central head incapacitated, whether it's fire or its own burning blood seals its fate, whether Herakles makes use of his bow and arrows against the beast beforehand, etc., and whether they choose to mention Athena's specific presence and involvement there. It seems evident that some of these writers and artisans were making direct transpositions from living mytho-religious traditions, now preserved for posterity, whereas others, as with some of the classical playwrights and literary authors, including Plato, were utilizing these traditions as more of a starting point and a springboard in order to showcase their own conceits. The combination of all of this making it not too hard to see how the classical and later modern pop cultural impressions of the combat wound up somewhat jumbled in some particulars as compared to the Vedic tradition's preserved account from perhaps 1,000 years earlier. The precise form of Athena's assistance to Herakles is left almost intentionally vague in most of these renditions. However, given the prominence of fire as a problem-solving tool presented in various of the more enduring popular accounts, it is unsurprising that some have ascribed the spark for the concept to her. Valerius Flaccus, for instance, in his Argonautica, written 7 centuries or more following Hesiod, describes it thus: The Tyrannithian Herakles, wearied in fight against the Hydra's dreadful hosts, turned to the fires of Pallas. That's the Mosley translation. And Pallas, of course, being the well-known epithet of Athena, and the fires of Pallas, assumedly referring to the fire, that which Herakles was instructed to make use of against his mortal foe by her. If it were the provision of insight, which Athena's aid to the hero took here, then this would indeed conceptually fit rather well with various other instances and occurrences from the classical milieu. Most prominently, perhaps, her impartment of a particular quality of Minos to Diomedes immediately before the latter is empowered to be able to fight and win against a succession of Greek gods who have taken to the field of war before Troy. Interestingly, if memory serves, in the cases of both Diomedes and Achilles, Athena's assistance is effectively represented in terms of poetic flame and fire about their brows. For more details upon this manifestation, please see my earlier Mahashivaratri and the Mytholinguistics of War, Part 3, The Mind, the Mania, and the Manu. And also more recently, our piece on Thor actually staying Jormungandr. It would not perhaps be hard to see how over 1,000 years or more, the received understanding of the myth might shift from Athena's providing empowerment and inspiration and insight to Herakles, accompanied by a visually apparent flame, therefore enabling him to slay the dragon, through to Athena providing the inspiration to use the flame to enable the dragon to be slain. There are also suggestions in various modern write-ups that the manner of Athena's assistance to Herakles took the form of a golden sword, the only weapon capable of truly killing the beast's otherwise immortal central head. However, I have as yet been unable to track down any direct and primary text attestations for this, and instead suspect it may be something of a conflation between the boon bestowing of various gods to Herakles at the outset of his labours, as mentioned in Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, and the bit immediately preceding that in the Bibliotheca, in which Athena does provide Herakles with weapons, in order to fight Eryginos and the Minyans at Thebes. But let us move over and backwards in time to the Vedic accounts of relevancy here. These are contained in several Rig-Vedic hymnals and their associated Brahmana commentary layer, and it is necessary to place several of these alongside one another in order to get a more full picture of proceedings than afforded by any of these sources alone. This does not make it an act of artificial conflation to bring these elements together, however, only an acknowledgement that the short portions of the relevant mythic recounting in each hymnal are the result of the Vedic rishis, the seers, in question prioritizing what portion of the tale was most important for the devotional purpose contained within which, at the time. The main such hymnal in question being RV 8100, inexplicably numbered RV 889 in some Griffith versions, which is dedicated to both Indra and Vak, and which contains a synopsis of various of the assistances rendered to Indra for his mighty combat against the demon dragon despoiler Vritra. These include elements well known and talked about elsewhere, such as Shayana, the falcon, otherwise known as Agni, bringing the Soma from the heavens for Indra's empowerment. And I note that this would therefore too connote fire as symbolic of both divine inspiration and the vitally important facilitator for dragon slaying, as we briefly examined earlier in reference to Herakles. But also, and rather more interestingly for our purposes, the strong element played by the goddess in Indra's victory against Vritra. A debt which acknowledges, or rather which Indra acknowledges in the course of the relevant hymnal, wherein he not only insists that Vak be given the honour share of the Soma sacrifice in recognition for her contribution, but also enthusiastically voices his acceptance of her offer of existence. Thou on my right shall be my friend and comrade. Then shall we two smite dead many full of foemen. RV 8102. The precise nature of Vak's role in this triumph is seen through RV 8100. It is a complex matter, and for reasons of space I have chosen to leave its in-depth explication for another article more directly upon the subject, which we ran a video of earlier in this week. But suffice to say, there are several strongly coterminous ways in which Vak contributes to the conflict, contingent upon which the account of the combat one is prioritizing, with a general theme that it is pious cooperation with Vak which makes available the essential tools to take down the dragon. These range in scope from Vak's role in the proper sacrificial conduct and honouring therein of her, which unlocks the Soma for Indra's use. For more details upon Vak Saraswati's role in this, please consult my earlier Somak Vasar, the Eric Vedic myth of the myth of poetry. This also includes through to Saraswati's role in preparing Indra's uniquely attuned weapon for the especial vulnerability of the foe, as seeth the Shatapatha Brahmana commentary upon the slaying of Namuchi, which I shall cover at greater depth in the aforementioned article, or otherwise making it available from the conceptual space of the waters, with what that represents in terms of congealed cosmic law, actively weaponized for demon slaying. Vak is also as the weapon, when the conjuring of the Vajra is done via sacred speech, as was done by Brihaspati, alongside Indra in some versions, wherein the Vajra may take the form of a meteor, a mountain being dropped from the heavens in an act of orbital bombardment, just to be sure, and which interestingly accords with some of the Greek accounts having the death of the Hydra only possible once Herakles does likewise, and drops a seriously large rock upon the beast's immortal head. And, last but not least, the rather dramatic epithet of Saraswati in RV 6617, Vrtraghni, the slayer of Vritra. This theonym, and its closely related forms, e.g. Vrtraghni, etc., is also more frequently encountered as an epithet for Lord Indra, although it is also occasionally found in reference to Agni, for example in RV 16:1. Fire as the dragon slayer would most certainly accord rather well with the design of Athena for the victory of Herakles, especially when it is Agni, in the sense of more than mere mortal and mundane ignition, but rather as pious flame, the flame of prayer, sacrifice, and the direct conduit to the divine. Perhaps this also resonates with the terrifying golden path associated with Saraswati's appearance as Vrtraghni in RV 661. Vrtraghni/Vrtraghni can also be translated in other ways, of course, as I explore in Saraswati Puja, the power of the smiter of foes. And in other contexts, smiter of resistance has been offered, due to Vritra carrying a meaning of an envelopment or an encirclement. There are, in effect, non-exclusive interpretations, as Vritra's role within the myth is precisely to be an envelopment and ensnarement of the waters and other such wealth, while offering resistance against the divine reclaimer adversaries, a resistance which, given Vritra's serpentine nature, would quite plausibly entail just such an enveloping constriction. The figure with the power to break through his coils in order to liberate that which he had illegitimately seized, therefore, would be Vrtraghni at least thrice over. Foe-slayer, meanwhile, is supposed to suggest something more specific than the general notion of a deity carrying out the killing of their enemies. After all, it would hardly be a noteworthy sobriquet if so. Instead, the idea is to connote that the deity in question is capable of vanquishing that tier of foe, those equal to Vritra, a figure who is powerful enough to give even much of the assembled pantheon pause and require especial preparatory measures before the chosen champion, in this case Lord Indra, is capable to take to the field with victory assured. Although to bring the matter back to Vak Saraswati in the context of this specific myth, there seems no reason to de-emphasize the rather literal and directly straightforward meaning to the epithet. It seems quite clear that but for Vak's involvement in proceedings, Vritra would not have been slain. The only serious question is just how hands-on Vak's contribution may have been. Whether it is, as we see in the much later Varaha Purana, wherein Devi kills the reincarnated Vritra again personally, or, for that matter, the literal litany of Devi demon-slaying, which forms the elegant core of the Shakta scriptural canon, or whether it is close to what we see in the Devi Shukta, RV 10.125.6, wherein Devi's dual contribution is to empower the prime divine weapon and its wielder to actually work for its designated and overpowering purpose, while planning and maneuvering in the manner of a general, a chess master or a strategic planner, to ensure the combat happens in the manner that ensures victory. And even if it is the latter, and leaving aside the metaphysical aspect of Vach as the weapon and understandings, this would still render Vach as much a slayer of Vritra as Napoleon was the conqueror of Europe, albeit more successfully and enduringly in Vach's case. A general does not necessarily personally take up arms in the field in order to be responsible for a victory. Indeed, the men and materials under their command are the weapons with which they fight, a pattern which may also bear itself out when we consider Athena's utilization of Diomedes, suitably divinely empowered and guided to fight off various other Olympians acting in service of the Trojans, whom she was barred from personally engaging. In one of those combats in particular, that of Diomedes against the war god Ares, it may be Diomedes who throws the spirit Ares, but it is, the invisible thanks to Hades' helm, Athena, who grabs and deflects Ares' spear away from her favourite, so that Diomedes lives to take his shot. And it is Athena herself who, open quotes, drove the spear into the pit of Ares' stomach, close quotes, once she had launched it. He had launched it, rather. Perhaps a similar pattern helps to explicate the Vrtraghni theonym of Saraswati that she shares with Indra. In any case, I have gone far enough for the moment with expository details from this tradition and that, and should now move through this piece's comparative conclusion. What we can state for certain is that both the Herakles contra Hydra and Indra against Vritra myths are significantly coterminous. In each case, the relevant striker/thunderer figure manages to successfully slay a multi-headed and supernaturally protected demon-dragon figure with watery associations. In each case as well, there is some special and specific positioning of the demon-dragon within the path of the heroic figure, as he is on a redemptive arc to their journey, which runs headlong into the hand of an angry deity. For Herakles, this is the 12 labours carried out in penitence for his slaying of his sons, with the wrathful deity being Hera, who has personally nurtured the Hydra for deployment against Herakles. For Indra, in various tellings, he is regarded as having attained the ire of Tvastir by killing Tvastir's son Thrasirias, and in the process acquiring the moral iniquity of a Brahmin killer, thus leading to Tvastir's sending a Vritra against him as revenge. And in each case, while the various tellings in circulation may differ upon the various particulars of the matter, there is a strongly recurrent theme of the dragon slaying in question requiring unusual means to be seen through to completion, facilitated through the actions and potentially the direct interventions of a certain wisdom warrior goddess. This may entail the provision of guidance or insight to the striker/thunderer about how to fight the dragon and overcome its warrings, and may involve the direct provision or guidance of munitions, of the weaponry via which the dragon is ultimately slain. There are, to be sure, also significant differences. Yet the curious thing is that in many of these cases there are far greater divergences within the classical or the Vedic canons themselves over these details rather than between the broad outlines of the myth in question, housed in either corpus. For example, the number of accounts in each wherein mention is not made of the presence of the goddess, or some other divine figure is present and involved. As previously explicated, an array of this is almost certainly intentional. There are easily dozens of Vedic hymnals which deal in whole or in part with the fight of Indra against Vritra, many of which have chosen to highlight, de-emphasize, or even outright overlook certain details to the occurrence due to what's most relevant for their particular ritualine purpose. It would seem fairly plausible that this concept would not be a Vedic innovation, but rather something which the post-Proto-Indo-European forebears of both Greek and Vedic civilization would have also made use of. Different perspectives upon the same mythic occurrence for different purposes, and which therefore have slightly, or more than slightly, differing details encapsulated therein. Meanwhile, the classical texts which touch upon the myth in question span almost a millennium in their dates of composition, which also means that they are between 1 and 2 millennia younger than their Vedic counterparts, hence more time to diverge both internally and from the foundational mythic kernel, and feature contributions or co-options from quite the diverse spectrum of writers, various forms of Greek, Romans, and playwrights looking to entertain, historians looking to present plausible-sounding, to the ears of the day, vignettes of the past, political propagandists, even potters, painters, and sculptors, and the occasional genuinely religious man, have all made their multifarious manners of marks upon the classical recollection of the myth of Herakles against the Hydra over that time. All of this together means that while the precise formulation of the original Proto-Indo-European myth in question is almost certainly irrecoverable, we can nevertheless state with great confidence that what we have identified fits comfortably and consistently within the general outlines of its bounds, and marvel again at the underlying unity of surface seeming somewhat disparate Indo-European mytho-religious belief. There is but one thing left to say, most apt for both a Friday and also for a Thursday for those of you in some other time zones. Vrtraghni, Vasti, Sustutim, I should say. Slayer claims our eulogy. Jai Mata Di.